Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm just absolutely delighted to welcome you to our second session on feeding cities, antiquity to the Middle Ages. I want to say a few quick words about the way we'll proceed today before we move on to the first of our afternoon speakers. And I hope, by the way, that those of you in the New York metro area have recovered from our earthquake. We don't, for those of you from outside the area, we don't normally get earthquakes, and this one was a 4.8. What we will do is that you will be muted throughout the presentations, but we want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question for the speaker, if you would put it either in the Q&A or in the chat, at the end of the speaker's presentation, I will read the questions and the speaker will have a chance to respond to you. So with that, I am absolutely delighted to introduce our first speaker for the afternoon. The first person we will be hearing from is Professor Mark Maltby. Mark and I have known each other for a long time, going back to sometime in the Middle Bronze Age. But Mark today is going to talk about people and animals in Roman and medieval Winchester. And we are absolutely delighted to have him speak. So thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Pam. Bear with me while I find my PowerPoint. Right. Well, hopefully nothing's going to be quite as earth-shattering as you've had in New York this morning. I'm going to be talking about the town of Winchester in the south of England. It's a town which has a long history, beginning in the late Iron Age, around about 200 BC, and it became a major Roman town with the town wall you see in the top right there, and up to about the 400 AD was one of the major towns in Roman Britain. It flourished again from the late Saxon period into the medieval period. King Alfred the Great in the Saxon period was there for quite a time. Winchester Cathedral was one of the most famous buildings and cathedrals in the south of England. And the medieval town followed the lines of the Roman town, and from the 9th, 10th centuries right the way through to the 16th century. It's had a lot of archaeological investigations since the 1960s by a variety of organisations, including the Winchester Museums, who have excavated mainly in the suburbs to the northwest and east, producing a volume back in 2012. And as part of that, I did the animal bones from some of those sites. About 20,000 bones identified from there, published back in 2010. The same sites going on into the Anglo-Saxon and medieval periods. The sites themselves were published in 2018, and the animal bones which came from those excavations have also been published by colleagues or ex-colleagues of mine, Jennifer Bull-Dillon, Dale Sargentson, Pippa Smith, Jenny Coy, and there's another 50,000 identified bones from that set of material as well. So that's a start. There have been other units working in Winchester over the last 2 or 3 decades as well. The Oxford Archaeology, for example, excavated a site within the walls at Northgate House, Staple Gardens. That's been published as well. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is from the Winchester Excavations Committee sites. They began excavating in the early 1960s, and most of their sites, as you can see from this map, are located within the walls as opposed to the suburbs. There are a number of sites which are important. I will be referring to a number of these as we go through, Lower Brook Street and Wolsey Palace being 2 of them. Over the years, they are producing a large series of monographs on various aspects of the findings that they obtained from these excavations. Here are a couple of them: Objects of the Economy, Environment and Agriculture in Early Winchester came out in 2022, and the latest of this series, Venta Belgarum, the Roman name of Winchester, the prehistoric Roman and post-Roman Winchester, came out recently at the end of 2023. So where have I come into all this? First of all, I'm dealing actually not with the bones much themselves, but mostly with the archives. The bones are still retained in various stores in Winchester, but most of the mammal bones were recorded by the Winchester team of Gina Adams, Pauline Shepherd, and others way back in the 1970s and 80s. Back in the day, paper archives, folks. Those were the days. What they did was a triage system where they selected the best groups. There's a lot of, as you can see, a multi-period site. There's a lot of potential contamination and mixing going on. So they selected basically the best groups, which had as little contamination as possible. And what they produced were summaries of the cattle, sheep, goat, pig elements and fusion counts in a series of folders, fairly consistently recorded, not totally, but fairly consistently recorded. And they also have folders of individual records and little summaries of dogs, cats, horse, rabbits, and hares, and so on. There are also files of the butchery records and diagrammatic form, and also some information about the pathology they looked at. They measured, you can start feeling the size of this assemblies. They measured over 10,000 mammal bones, which was digitized some time back. I ought to say that most of their work was in the 1970s and 80s. Everyone's moved on. There's been a pause really in the examination of this material for a couple of decades. And for my sins, I think I volunteered. I'm not quite sure how it happened. I agreed I'd try and help out. So basically, this is an archaeology of archives as much as archaeology of the bones themselves in some ways. Anyway, so they also digitized or had digitized the mandible aging data in a slightly different way to the way I do it, which is why I've re-examined 2,900 of the over 4,600 mandibles. So there, I'm really confident that we've got a consistent pattern now. I've also produced spreadsheets of cattle, sheep, and pig. Those are the numbers involved there. It comes up to around about 90,000 bones. We've got the individual element counts and the fusion data, nearly 20,000 records of those for all the sites and phases where they produce detailed records. I've created a database of the individual horse records, which they created from the paper records. I also looked at a load of rabbit and hare bones, and that's now on access as well. And I'm doing the same sort of thing on the deer bones, which have been kept out. And I can actually have another look at those to confirm identifications. Back in the day, the late Jenny Coy recorded the bird bones. There is a paper archive available. The digital version of that has unfortunately been totally corrupted. So that's an interesting challenge to come. The fish bones have been recorded by Sheila Hamilton Dyer, mostly from hand excavation. So anyway, that's what the information is. So between myself and the previous work going to now into the Roman period, from the work from the sites I looked at or have recorded, and the sites which were looked at by me and others back in 2010, overall there's about 38,000 bones, and cattle 45%, sheep, mostly sheep, goat 39%, pig 16%. That's the overall figures. It's not untypical of Roman urban sites in this country, but I'm much more interested in not the overall picture, but how they vary. So I'm going to look at three sets of material from these Roman sites: the Lower Brook Street up to the north there, On the right hand southeast side, the Wolvesey Palace, and an excavation down at the south gate. The results of the main three species, I'm going to inflict you with a lot of histograms, so apologies for that. Here we've got three sites: Brook Street, Southgate, and Wolvesey Palace. Blue is cattle, brown is sheep, green is pig. If you look at the right there, Wolvesey Palace, reasonably typical of the overall percentage figures, dominated by cattle, 50%. Contrast that to on the left, Brook Street has a lot more sheep, and then the one in the middle, Southgate, nearly all cattle. So I love that sort of thing. Nice variations. What's caused it? Here's the Southgate excavation. It's a very small area, actually, by the entrance, excavated in 1971. And the bones which were looked at by the team back in the 1970s were down in the hollow by the edge of the ramparts, dated in this particular assemblage to about the 3rd century. And just to simplify things, what I'm going to show is a selection of the main type of bones which were found in this group of cattle. So I've separated the mandible, the shoulder blade, the scapula. I've grouped together the upper limb bones, humerus, femur, radius, tibia and ulna, and the metapodials, just to have a look and see what relative numbers there are. And here we have them. So the three sites again there: Brook Street, fairly equal numbers of those if you all count them together in percentage terms. Wolvesey Palace, similar sorts of things again. As you can see, Southgate is almost totally dominated by upper limb bones. These upper limb bones have been butchered in very consistent ways. Here you can see some filleting marks made by the edge of the cleaver, which is very typical of urban specialist urban butchery, which you find on these sort of sites, but there's intensively butchered. Most of the bones in this group are also split longitudinally, as they are from these are from other sites in Winchester, but there's a whole load of these from the Southgate site. Now, it's not unusual, well, it's not totally uncommon anyway, to get groups like this in Roman sites. Top left there is a set of material from a small inland port, Romanised site from Cambridgeshire. And on the right-hand side is a group of similar bones split in the same way with the same sort of butchery marks, coming from a cellar from a fairly small settlement, of villa, or slightly industrial sort of villa from Gloucestershire. So they're not that unusual. And as a main parallel to we're found in the Southgate site, this is a set of material from Gloucester, and again near the walls, 3 pits just stuffed full of these sort of bones. What caused them? There's the hollow again. I'll just refer you to the site report which came out last year. The lower fills of the hollow were contemporary with the construction of the wall, indicate that the hollow was used as a working area during the construction of the masonry defences, possibly a mortar mixing floor. Now, I've always been a bit suspicious. There's been some interpretations of these sort of groups as sort of soup kitchens and that sort of thing. I've never really bought that, simply because of some of the context. Now, there's a possibility, I suggest, that bone marrow and grease might have been used in mortar or plaster. I've said this, or suggested this for years, but no one believed me. Well, no, it had mixed reviews, let's put it that way. But I've found in fairly recent times that people have started to find animal proteins identified in Roman mortar in other parts of the empire. So I've got a feeling that we were looking in that sort of deposit. Whatever it is, it's certainly an industrial deposit which has caused that variation. So that's the relative percentages again from these Roman sites. Brook Street, then why are there a load of sheep there? This is Wolvesey Palace on the other side, fairly well to-do Roman houses, residential area. By Brook Street, however, we have a Roman temple and a later Roman workshop in that area. I've done the same sort of thing as I did with cattle for the types of sheep bones represented, slightly different with the mandible and maxilla together, the front upper limb scapulohumerus separated from the femur and tibia, and then the metacarpal and metatarsal. These are the figures. Brook Street on the left has a higher number of the jaws and metapodials than we have at Wolsey Palace. It's more primary butchery waste going into that area, may well be associated with what's going on in the temples. Anyway, that's one of the differences. Going on into the medieval period, three main sites to look at here. Lower Brook Street again, Wolsey Palace again, and on the far left there, the site of the castle yard. Give you some idea of the excavations. Here's the Brook Street, with you can see a church foundations in the foreground. I wanted to point out that we know the name of the road, Tanner Street. Get ready for what's going to come in a minute. Wolsey Palace, a rather different sort of site. It's the residence of the bishops of Winchester from the 12th century onwards. And then there's the excavations taking place there back in the late 60s. Winchester Castle, it's the Great Hall there. And between the Great Hall and the castle ditch, they excavated in the castle yard there as well. So three different sorts of sites, two high status. So what are the percentages like? Same idea again, Brook Street on the left, mostly cow and sheep, fairly equal numbers if you count them all together. Everything in the brackets, incidentally, is a sample sizes on these. Not a lot of pig. Contrast that with Castle Yard and Wolsey Palace. The grey for the pig, much more pig turning up there, much less cattle. And there's a tendency in medieval Britain that higher status sites tend to produce more pig bones. So that sort of fits in with the two sites we have at Wolsey Palace and the castle. Meanwhile, down at Brook Street, in this road named Tanner Street, there are tanning pits dated to the Anglo-Saxon and early high medieval period. And as you can see there, they're found there. And rather nicely, loads and loads of cattle metapodials. And also, going back to yesterday, some very large groups in some deposits are nearby of goat horn cores, mostly male goats as well, which have been collected in there. So we've got some specialist processing going on with hides. Going back to the cattle, these are the same sort of bones which we had from the Roman sites, comparing those again. And from Brook Street in yellow on the metapodials, pretty well represented. Blue for the mandibles, also pretty well represented throughout. So that, and if I went down to individual pits, the metapodials and jaws would be even higher than they are there. Contrast that with what's coming out of the castle yard site. The grey are the upper limbs, and the metapodials and mandibles are much less in number. So we're dealing more with consumption material in those sort of sites, which is quite a nice contrast. And also at Wolsey Palace, exactly the same pattern there. The grey for these upper limb bones, the main meat bones, dominated there, hardly any jaws turning up in comparison throughout the medieval period. In terms of sheep, Brook Street again, fairly equal numbers of the four groups I was mentioning before, looking mostly on the first four, which are the larger samples there. Contrast that again with Wolsey Palace. We've got the scapulo and humerus in brown, and the grey of the femur and tibia. And you can see how much the upper limb bones are dominating in those assemblies as well. So it's consumption, food waste turning up in this higher status site. The mandibles, just starting to work on these sort of things. Contrasting here, Brook Street and Wolsey Palace in the 11th to 12th century samples. And going across Brook Street, reasonably high numbers of adult cattle. There's a lot of plough cattle, we know from documentary evidence around this time. Interestingly enough, a rather higher proportion of these are turning up in the Wolsey Palace assemblage. By the time we get to the late medieval, the very early post-medieval period, rather a contrast takes place, particularly at Wolsey Palace in brown. We're starting to get a load of calves turning up in the assemblage. That may be to do with food, but there's also, we know, a major increase in the dairy production taking place in the late medieval period, and veal, of course, is a byproduct of that process. So a nice contrast again overall, though, between the two sites. Always looking for comparisons and contrasts. Sheep, again, this is the early phases, going down to the right, the middle, the three groupings on the right from the 24 months onwards. We know one of the major industries in medieval Britain was the wool industry, so not surprising that we have a bias towards adult sheep in all the assemblages. And by the time we get to the 14th and 15th century, that highest group there on the right-hand side, even older sheep or more older sheep turning up there, and the wool industry and cloth industry is at its peak. But do notice a contrast again on the left there. There's rather more young lambs turning up at the Wolvesey site compared to Brook Street. Just for the sake of completeness, pigs, looking at two sites, Wolvesey Palace and Brook Street. Most of the pigs, or a lot of the pigs, killed immature into their first and second years. Immature and sub-adults, as I've categorised them there. And looking at Wolvesey Palace through three medieval phases, we don't get a huge amount of change there. Mostly on that side are sub-adult animals killed in their second year. But one thing I'm going to be following up is that there is quite a contrast in the jaws, or quite a variation in the jaws, in the amount of wear you find on them in relation to the eruption. These are two jaws of fairly equal eruption stages. The M3 has recently come into wear, but you will see the top mandible, the first model there, so it's much heavier wear than the one below it. And so we have here evidence of differential diets, more attritional diet involved with the top one, which may be linked to where they were being kept and so on. And following on Flint's talk yesterday, there is absolutely huge potential for isotope studies along the lines he was talking about yesterday. Plus, you could add strontium to that as well. If money can be found to follow that up, there's a huge potential there. Moving on to what else they might be finding. Deer. Now we're dealing with low numbers here overall. We're dealing with less than 1% of the cattle, sheep, pig and deer bones are of the various deer species from the Roman sites, the medieval sites as well. The only slight differences are slightly higher versions of numbers coming from the Castle Yard, early medieval, the 1% red deer, and then you see in the bottom right the Wolvesey coming up at 2.3%. Not a huge amount, but at least significantly higher than elsewhere, and again linked to higher status. And then when you actually look at the types of fallow deer bones which appear, you'll see that there is the expected bias on these high status sites towards the hind limbs, the haunches, which is linked to the rules of engagement and hunting, which were taking place in the medieval times. Hares and rabbits, two types of hares in Britain. They're probably mostly brown hair by the times we're dealing with here. Do we get many of them? Not. Look on the left here, that's the NISP, and here I've done the NISP between hare, rabbits and sheep, and just comparing with sheep, goat. Yes, the percentage of hare increases at Brook Street. This is for Brook Street there, compared to there, and we start seeing rabbit, which were reintroduced in the Norman period, starting to increase a little bit in the latest phases, 15th, 16th century. Wolvesey Palace, now notice a subtle change of scale on the left-hand side there. We're not dealing with 1% anymore, we're doing the 10% of rabbits by the time we get to the 15th and 16th centuries. Again, more evidence for a more diverse diet going on. Back at Castle Yard, there's a castle keep there. There's a guard robe dated to the 16th century. It's stuffed full of rabbit. These are some of them from the guard robe. And look at the scale on the left now, we're going into there 70-80%. So in that guard rope, when you just compare the numbers of hare, rabbit and sheep, it's loads and loads of rabbits are turning up in that particular deposit. Okay, so that's the zooarchaeology. That's what I'm comfortable with. But there is a huge amount of information which has been gleaned about the documentary data by Derek Keane and others, 2 volumes you can see there published back in the day. And it's fantastic, really. We know on the left here where the butchers, where the fishmongers and where the spicers and the poulterers, where their properties were. Is that sort of detail for the work of Derek Keane's fantastic on this. We know roughly the numbers of butchers there were in the town at various times. And regarding the Bishop of Winchester estates, which cover quite a substantial part of southern England, we have the Winchester Pipe Rolls, which are annual accounts of the Bishops of Winchester estates in Latin. Luckily, 2 of them have been translated into English for the likes of me. They include records of numbers of livestock on the estate. So we've got another line of evidence which we can look at, which I will quickly explain through this. What I want to do in what I write up is not just a zooarchaeology. I really want to link it in with other things as well. So let's just use horse as an example. A zooarchaeology, what I did there, this is Roman. Again, on the left, that's the sites from the inside at the walls, 2% compared to cattle. This is just cattle versus horse, no more than 3%. On the outskirts, rather more horses turning up there, including a large amount which are associated with worked bone deposit out in the western suburbs. So that's not untypical of Roman towns, that variation. And near the cemetery, not counted in the above, are some horse burials, as say, associated in a human cemetery as well. So they've been treated differently to cattle. We're not surprised by that. By the time we get to the medieval period, 1%, 2%, 3%, fairly typical all the way around. But yes, that's the zooarchaeology. What else can we glean about what animals or horses and humans were doing in Winchester at the time? Well, yes, they were making the occasional bone skates out of horse metacarpals. There is some butchered bones in old periods. I've always wondered whether they're really all destined for humans or rather more likely to be for dogs, in my view. But we've got all sorts of evidence which have been published, which I want to link back into and cross-reference in terms of how I think Winchester and its animals were related. So we've got horseshoes, loads of them turning up. We have horse riding and harness gears. This is just the medieval. These are some seeds, oat mostly. Oat is mostly used for horse fodder, we know. This comes from a bell mould from Cathedral Green, one of the sites in the centre of the town. And those seed remains probably came from horse dung, which were incorporated into the clay. And again, documentary evidence, Derek Keane noted that in Jura Street, it was blocked with horse dung in the 1420s. So it's certainly an interesting commodity to have. Going down to the Bishops of Winchester estates, we have these records, and you won't be able to see that in detail, but this is some work Claridge has done there. And I'm just putting it on there to remind myself that they're divided into categories: colts, foals, young foals, cart horses, plough horses, and so on. I'm not saying, of course, that all these animals ended up in Winchester, but it gives us another dimension of seeing how animals and humans operated in the general area and the contrast. So I want to bring that sort of thing into it as well. So there we are, really. There's the bones, there's the cathedral. I just put on the inset there. They've got a peregrine falcon living or nesting up there for the last few years, so there's still animals there. As you can probably tell, we're in fairly early days of me trying to sort this out. Eventually, there's going to be Winchester Studies 9.2. It's going to be the animals of early Winchester, which I'm editing as soon as I can. I keep getting asked. I want to thank the Winchester Excavations Committee of Kath Barclay and colleagues for their help through their times. And I want to thank you lot and Pam for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was fabulous. And I have to say, you know, from a personal perspective, this is where I started my archaeological career back as an undergrad and working at the Brook Street site. And I'm just delighted to see that. let me quickly see what we have in terms of Q&A and chat. And I will start out with the first question, actually, because I was taken with your horse metapodia that had been made into skates, and I wondered if you had seen anything similar with the cattle metapodia, because I've seen in the sort of 10th century material from Antwerp, I've seen both cattle and horse made into skates and sledges.
I will emphasize again, personally, I may not have done because I haven't seen many of the bones myself. This is a very strange sight. I would have to get back to you on that. I can't remember any. There is, from the tanning areas, quite a lot of bones mentioned, but I think it's the case where they've been chopping the ends off and using the shafts for bone working. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I can think of some from Russia, same sort of period.
And along with the metapodia, because that's the bit even before I had taken zooarchaeology that I remember washing bones in the Book Street site and seeing lots and lots of cattle metapodia. Were you seeing a lot of evidence for traction pathology? And I know you're working with the archives, but did the people who initially recorded them see them?
They mentioned it. I haven't quantified what they've seen yet. But again, as I say, there are boxes of material which I'll be re-examining, and there are, I've not had a chance to look at them. The curious box says pathology and things like that. So I should be going back through those and comparing their original records. It's not going to be, if you like, as precise. Again, looking at Flint's paper yesterday, where he was able to do get the sort of figures and percentages of it. Don't think I'm going to be able to get to that level. But reading what I've seen, there certainly are the classic sort of splaying of the metacarpals and that sort of thing turning up in some of them, and similar damage to the phalanges as well, first phalanges in particular, but not quantified yet. But it certainly exists, and I would be surprised if it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the advantages of being able to go back to these assemblages that were excavated in the 60s and 70s, because it's one of the things that we've been doing with the Dunallen material when I was in Ireland last summer is, when I looked at this stuff in the early 80s, I mean, the paleopathology on traction really hadn't been standardized until the 90s. So we went back and pulled out all the metapodia and first phalanges, and I hadn't seen much that looked drastically pathological, and I'm happy to say we didn't see much the second time around. But it's, I think, one of the real advantages to this is that you have the ability to go back now, and as you say, things that we could do with strontium if there's the money. Okay, we have some questions from other people on the use of marrow or grease and mortar. Do you have any inclinations about the balance of use between cattle for food and cattle for manufacturing?
Good question, whoever that was. No. Interesting to say the proportion of that. There is clearly, I think, in terms of the towns, specialist butchers operating, and certainly in terms of cattle, seemingly having a lot of control what's being moved around. I've not talked about the cattle scapula today. There's very distinctive butchery marks on there, and I'm fairly convinced that there are scapular shoulder joints being cured and actually being moved around out of towns as well. That's not industrial. There are these deposits. I've mentioned the upper limb bones. One area which we looked at in 2010 from the suburbs, there is a real bone working site made from a lot of the same sort of bones. They're making bone spoons and that sort of things as well. Yeah, the main thing would be for food, but for the first time, probably in Britain, they were creating quite a pile of potential waste, which is follows on into the medieval period as well. But so what I like about it is that there are people who must have been stockpiling, literally and figuratively, this material to actually then move on for the next stages. The initial stages are all the same. They're butchering them and filleting them in the same way. What happens to the bones after that seems to vary, and there may well have been commissions to say, right, we need this set of material for whatever it is. Mortar is one possibility. There are other things as well. which they could have been used for.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I think the industrial use of bone in both the Roman and the medieval world is something that interests me quite a bit. Another question I've got is what, and this comes back from, you know, my undergraduate days. We had worked through the 9th, 10th century houses that we were had been identified from the sort of Middle Saxon period, and then we were coming down on the Roman. Is there much in the way of the time period in between, let's say, the 4th and the 9th that you have?
I don't. There is certainly things going on in small amounts in terms of the material I've been dealing with. There's an awful lot of residual stuff, and therefore not much I can contribute. But it wasn't abandoned, but it's not rich, if you know what I mean. It's very typical of what we're finding in lots of other, if you like, post-Roman towns.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, that covers the questions, and I think the timing is just about perfect. So I will move on to our second presentation of the afternoon, and this one will be presented by John Soderberg from Denison University. And basically, John, as many of you know, has done a great deal of work on early monastic towns in Ireland. And the title of his talk is "What Does Feeding Cities Nurture? Diverse Urbanisms in Early Medieval Britain and Ireland." And I will silence myself and let him share his screen.
Okay, thank you, Pam, and thank you for organizing these wonderful papers. Let me just pull up my presentation here. 1 second while I get that organized. There. Okay, is that coming through for people? Since I'm not hearing anything, I will assume yes. I said thank you very much, Pam. I appreciate the whole event and have really enjoyed the papers. And I also appreciate the way that you framed the conference initially in terms of Gordon Child's concept of an urban revolution involving separation of production and consumption, which then becomes the basis for profound changes in societies that emerge. That certainly, you know, is a motivating impulse for zooarchaeologists looking at urbanism. One of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about that is adding in Max Weber's orientation on the ways that cities create hinterlands by creating a subordinate zone for maximizing supplies. And I think at least since the turn of the millennium, a pretty solid consensus has emerged that these sorts of approaches are too simple. The entanglements between rural and urban areas are much more complex than that sort of opposition would apply. And also think it also broad consensus that certainly people here are working on, that the social dynamics are just more variable. And I say at least since the turn of the millennium, because I think it actually is probably a really pervasive view. And I think some of these debates have gone back all the way to the time of living in the cities themselves, because in recent years there's been a really wonderful development in ways people are thinking about very complex entanglements between rural and urban areas, which makes it a really wonderful moment to think back on, you know, where does this big idea about the development of urbanism fit in? The next question along those lines is why look at these sorts of questions in Northern Europe? It is a bit of an odd choice. Urbanism tends to be kind of late. It's often a fairly minor presence on the landscape, and it has variable relationships to the social dynamics of the period, including state formation. But Pam has a number of publications which suggest, I think very thoughtfully, that these oddities might be exactly why this is an interesting region to look at. it is a place where we can deepen the pool of possibilities for who and what causes urbanism. And in particular, for me, it's an opportunity to think about, in some ways, the minimum conditions for what qualifies as urban, and the ways that sort of investigation can elicit lots of interesting questions about what are we actually talking about in terms of rural and urban entanglements when we're looking at Ireland. As Pam was saying, I specifically look at Ireland, and there is an additional question as to why look at urbanism in Ireland. And certainly the subject of what fails to qualify as urban is often something that brings up the subject of Ireland. For much of the 20th century, Ireland was thought of as somehow or other opposed culturally and sociologically and economically to the development of urbanism. I'm giving you a quote here, which is saying that when the people started the Irish Historic Town Atlas series in the early 80s, we realized that settlement history suffered under an invasion neurosis caused by the belief that successive changes in the Irish countryside were to be exclusively attributed to the arrival of a new ethnic group. The Irish scholar D.A. Binchy wrote in '54, urban civilization was more or less imposed on the Irish from the outside. And this is a perspective that remained vital well in the 20th century, where thinking that it wasn't really until the Anglo-Norman period that you start getting real urban presence in Ireland. The series of excavations in the post-war period began to change that set of thinking, as coastal trading centers, often associated with the Vikings, began to appear that mirrored a lot of what was showing up elsewhere in Europe. And certainly by the later part of the 20th century, it became clear that there were urban centers in Ireland well back into the first millennium. But there was an enduring sense in this case, even while people were debating very seriously about how these fit into the larger Irish context, that there was still a certain external element to it, and people have struggled quite a bit to figure out how you look at these, as the term used for now is Hiberno-Norse. How do you look at them as deeply part of the Irish context? For my part, I think an interesting counterpart to the arguments about urbanism in Ireland has precipitated around the idea of monasteries. And the idea here is that prior to, or at latest contemporary, was the rise of coastal trading centers, certain monasteries grew into urban settlements. And this is an interesting opportunity to think about alternatives to top-down models that are heavily dependent on craft intensification, because if you get further back into towards the middle of the first millennium, you have centuries of agricultural intensification in Ireland. You have centuries of very interesting vibrancy around sacred centers and monasteries and these sorts of things. But you don't see much in the way of social hierarchy and intensive commodity production, particularly in the areas associated with these sorts of monasteries, which are often inland and away from these coastal trading centers. So they're an opportune moment to start thinking about what causes urbanism. And I want to show you a reasonably lengthy quote here, because as I said before, in some ways, the ideas about richer connections between rural and urban centers have something that have come to the fore in the last couple of decades. But these kind of debates also go back into the beginnings of these urban centers themselves. It's more or less, as far as I can tell, this sort of debate has been a part of what it is that we are looking at in all of these periods. And as you'll see on the screen here, this is a quote from a monastic named Cogitosis around 700, speaking of Kildare, and saying, and what words are capable of setting forth the very great beauty of this church and the countless wonders of that monastery, which we may call a city, if it is possible to call a city that which is enclosed by no circle of walls. You can see right here, we are back to debating what is the definition of an urban center. And he goes on to say, since numberless people assemble within it, and since a city gets its name from the fact that many people congregate there, it's a vast and metropolitan city, together with all its outlying suburbs. It's the safest city of refuge in the whole land of the Irish for all fugitives. And who can reckon the various crowds and the innumerable peoples who flock there from all the provinces? Some come for the abundance of the feast, others to obtain relief from their ailments, some to gawk at crowds. I think that might be my favorite theory of the development of urbanism in Ireland, is gawking at crowds. Others come with great gifts or tribute to take part in the ceremonies on the feast day of Holy Bridget. And I think it's instructive there that Cogitosis is giving us a whole sequence of theories for what is it that drove the development of these centers, and are they legitimately called cities, and what sorts of things do we need to think about? And there are a whole bunch of concepts here. In other contexts, I'd spend more time talking about more detailed ideas about what it is when he refers to a city of refuge, or more loosely translated, a sanctuary city. That concept and the development of that concept as a basis for understanding what is it that causes some of the changes we associate with urbanism is linked to a whole fascinating set of changes in anthropology, including biological anthropology, evolutionary theory, and a whole bunch of other areas. And I have a quote here from Sarah Hardy, whose core opposition to a very similar set of theories in evolution to what we're talking about in kind of top-down models of urbanism, is the point is not to share, but to establish and maintain social networks. And I think a lot of what draws me to think about urbanism around monasteries in Ireland is thinking about how is it that these sort of social networks themselves are a fuel for urbanism, and they are part of what we're nurturing. I was fortunate enough to be able to work at probably the best opportunity to understand how one of these places work, because Clonmacnoise did not see much development after the Middle Ages, and so it's one of the few that didn't turn into a subsequent town. So there's a lot of possibilities for excavating, and it is also the most thoroughly excavated of all of the possible ones. You can see here that it's located on the Shannon River, where the Shannon River meets an Esker Ridge running down here. You can see, if you can see my cursor here, you can see that running right there. This makes this a crossroads for east-west and north-south movement through Ireland. And the Shannon River floods in this area, producing this rich meadowland called the Callows, which fills up. So this is a rich location. Here you can see a view of what the monastery looks like today on a little rise up above the Shannon River, between the Shannon River and the Eskers behind it. It is a famous monastery for all sorts of reasons. It is had an immensely important scriptorium associated with it. The Lower and the Hedra is a 12th century manuscript that's known. It is one of the sources for the famous cattle raiding epic, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, and a bunch of other tales. It is a place of monumental architecture, these famous high crosses. There are lots of reasons why we know that Clonmacnoise was a significant place, and one of the more sacred places probably in Northern Europe. As I said before, it also happens to have been a site of a significant amount of excavation. And if you can catch the numbers on here, you can see that in this arc all the way around the edge here, here's the center of the monastery, all around the edge, there have been a series of excavations in all of these areas. So we have now a fairly good sense of what this place would have looked like in the early Middle Ages. And I'll just give you a couple of highlights from some of the other excavations. Excavation in 2003, which identified a enclosing ditch around the monastery, which seemed to have been filled fairly quickly after it was dug, and the lower layers of the fill suggests that that was probably a late 8th century, maybe early 9th century activity. There was also a bridge located, the remains of a bridge, I should say, located in the Shannon River adjacent to the monastery, where you would have crossed over into Connacht, across the Shannon River here. And it is among the most sophisticated architectural constructions from this period, dendrodated to 804. So tremendously sophisticated development across here. So very, very dynamic place. There were also a couple of keyhole excavations, so a couple of square meters at the center of the monastery. When the visitor centers were created, you're looking now at the cross that stands outside of it. It is a fiberglass replica of the original, which is now inside the visitor center. And there was an opportunity to do some excavation underneath these as they were removed, and really fascinating kind of telephone booth sort of excavations. Probably the most significant thing which came out of them is that there's occupation back perhaps certainly back into the early 7th century, and occupation evidence, a whole range of activities going on there up until about 700, when the area seems to have been cleared and reserved for burial and other obviously more ceremonial activities from that point. The largest single excavation at Clonmacnoise is the new graveyard excavations, which you can see indicated here, a view from the round tower up down over them. And these are located in a graveyard that has developed around outside of the core burial ground since the 19th century. And essentially the excavation was a matter of excavating family plots prior to them being used for burial. And it ended up being about 10 years worth of excavation. I think something like 1,500 square meters ultimately excavated, largely contiguous here. You can see here one of the larger openings. I think this is 1997. About somewhere, probably average depth of about a meter worth of deposits. In some cases, well over a meter. I don't think it ever got to 2 meters anywhere, but very rich deposits. Total artifact count is something on the order of 6,000 artifacts. So really rich opportunity to get a peek into what these settlements would have looked like, and really one of the first times we've been able to get a really clear picture of what they look like. Unfortunately, Heather King, the excavator, passed away prior to being able to finish her work on the excavation, and they do remain unpublished to this point, which is a circumstance which I hope will be changing in the near future. There's certainly some movements around that. But it certainly puts a bracket around anything that I have to say, and that there is a degree of preliminary results here. Heather got very far in the work, and I think that my suspicion is that this phasing might be refined. I don't think it will be substantially overturned. And she roughly speaking, organized the most of the deposits into 3 different phases, running from the 7th century up through roughly 1300, so the full span of the early Middle Ages. And phase 1 is particularly significant because that's the period prior to when we know the coastal trading centers were starting to flourish. So this would be a particularly important opportunity to get a sense of what was going on in that early phase. Phase 2 is contemporary with them flourishing, and then on through the end of the first millennium. Here's a quick sketch plan. Lots of structures built here, some roads. I've been really struck listening to some of the other papers, which have been and a little bit envious, the wonderful exploration of the tensions between public and private space, studies of variation from place to place within a site, and there's continuing work to go on, and I have been able to identify a few places where there are some very subtle variations. But one of the circumstances here is that there really is not a strong distinction across the site. It's very uniform across the site, and that sort of public-private distinction is not coming out, certainly in the animal bones, and I suspect in some ways not in the in the other archaeology, which I think is something worth thinking about in terms of understanding what's going on in Ireland at this point in time. It said my core question is this set of issues surrounding this curious sort of urbanism, which does not seem to be linked into the things that people are typically citing as central to the development of urban centers. And I was fortunate enough that this site produced what at least then was probably one of the larger faunal assemblages that was very richly preserved and a nicely stratified site to give us an opportunity to understand what can we learn about the urban rural entanglements, as I was talking about before. And again, not the time to go into some of the background on this, but my fundamental motivation with looking at these animal bones is to put them on the same footing as these classic high value ecclesiastical items, which we think of as emblematic of what was driving these monastic establishments and all the things associated with them, and to put the animal bones as on equal footing with those, as crucial to people's interaction with these deeply sacred centers. And I cannot believe that that would not have been part of people's experience. And certainly most people's primary contact with the place would have been via these animals, and kind of I'd like to make them a vital piece of how we understand what was going on at these sort of sites. What I'd like to do now is to assault you with yet more graphs. This is the real challenge of being the third faunal analyst to get going is the number of graphs has been piling up all afternoon. But I do want to give you a sense of the sorts of things that I've been able to find. What you're looking at here is a NISP calculation of the various species which are here. There is some interesting change you can see from the first phase through the third phase, particularly in terms of a declining prevalence of cattle and an increasing prevalence of both sheep and pig. I'm not going to show you the MNE numbers. This would be muted a little bit and would show up more as a little smaller scale change and more about change from a decline in cattle to a rise in pig. But all that is within the larger set of issues that there is nothing remarkable about this species spread here. This is very close to the means for early medieval Ireland, and one of the larger points that I think it's important to recognize about monasteries, in the small monasteries that assemblages I've done, they're farms. They just plain are farms. They're not remarkable in many ways. And similarly, this is not a remarkable site. You're not looking at some dramatic break from what you see elsewhere in medieval Ireland. The single most notable difference is the prevalence of red deer. They are present, particularly in the first phase here by NISP, but in general, present almost an order of magnitude higher than you see typically at a site. And that is one of the very few characteristic signatures of monastic foodways that I can identify. That there does seem to be a connection with red deer, and that gets entangled in a whole bunch of other really interesting tensions between ecclesiastical and secular powers in Ireland. Other thing I'll point here, just as a point of note for early medieval Ireland, it is one of the places where you see a very bimodal dog size. These are Finbar McCormick's data from a variety of sites where you tend to see small sized dogs in that shoulder height range, and then large sized dogs in that range. And that does continue through all three phases of Clonmacnoise. They're not evenly represented in each one, but those two are very distinct. Bimodal distribution is there throughout. It is one thing that does seem to go away in the second millennium. So once you get into the Anglo-Norman period, that there is a change in dog management, so that you see a much wider variety of sizes, which is an interesting pattern. As I said, there have been a number of excavations around the site, and before I'm going to mention one particular find from elsewhere, but you can see here the new graveyard is right here. So most of my peek into Clonmacnoise is coming from that area. I have looked at assemblages from two other parts of the excavation, so kind of on the opposite side of the enclosure, which was a great relief to me to look at, to kind of get a sense of, is there something deeply peculiar about the new graveyard? And overall, those two areas are showing up, broadly speaking, the same patterns. One point, actually, Pam, you earlier was asking about bone skates, and Stinborg McCormick certainly has come up with cattle metapodia. I think they're from Dublin. They could be from Waterford, but from one of the coastal trading sites, they're there. One of the other sites at Clonmacnoise produced a dog with shoulder heights between 75.3 and 73.2 centimeters, which I'm having trouble finding larger dogs in Britain and Ireland and in Europe more generally. And I've got one PhD there that was surveying this, and the largest dog that they found were 74.9. So in this sort of range. And I would just put out a call. I would love information on anybody who has bigger dogs, because this is currently one of the larger dogs I can find in medieval Europe. Moving on to the individual species. As I said before, you can see some degree of change. We have a decline in cattle. Sheep, goat really do not vary enormously. There's a little bit of a rise in the third period. There's an interesting set of thoughts about the middle of the first millennium in Ireland, that you may see a decentering of cattle as a core feature of socioeconomic values as part of a whole wider series of changes. That I think occurs in some places, but distinctly not in other places. And you would expect it between phase 1 and phase 2 at Clonmacnoise. It doesn't appear there. It may be delayed in showing up in the second millennium at Clonmacnoise. That's certainly an interesting possibility. But in any case, it is late there. The other feature about the third phase, which is notable, is that you do see a rise in rates of fragmentation. People seem to be working the bones harder, either for food or for various craft working or various kinds of manufacturing there. And I think you're starting to see people extracting more out of it, whether it's for food or craft material. Here's a quick view of just what some of the elements that are different. And it's very hard for me to make a whole lot of conclusion out of this. I've spent a lot of time trying to see if I could make an argument for specific changes in how carcasses are being worked here. Certainly the increase in metacarpals, fragmentation rate on metacarpals, and some other things about the prevalence of metacarpals does lead me to think that you might see something going on there with working this particular element that is most suited for craft working, pins, skates, or whatever else you're producing with them. So that's one possibility. But I'm not tremendously comfortable with that. Probably the most notable feature of the cattle assemblage is the age. And as you've heard in earlier talks, and if you've ever counted this subject before, one of the primary questions that people are looking at is the age of cattle, with the set of assumptions that you often see a limited range of animals making it into cities. So that's a key key basis for transport. And in particular, in a lot of places in early medieval Northern Europe, you see an emphasis on very old cattle coming in, which are almost certainly a result of the cattle, which are the cattle largely female in the case of Clonmacnoise, which are no longer productive to dairy herders in the countryside, being sent into the town. And that is what you're seeing at Clonmacnoise. It matches very closely with, in this yellow bar here, you can see a major site from Dublin, matches with a lot of places where you can see, whoops, excuse me, wrong button here, a number of the over 36 bracket is by far the most common one. Typically 50% or more of the individuals are coming out of that, and you have very few individuals in the younger marketing ages. There is an interesting difference. You can see here in the middle ages between the lower numbers you're seeing at Fishamble Street, and you are seeing some more younger, presumably more palatable, closer to market age animals coming into Clonmacnoise. And I think that's certainly something worth thinking about in terms of what sorts of animals are making their way into this site, and what's motivating them getting there. One issue, the particular age method that I'm using is oriented on third molars more in some ways than I would. It's been the format that's been used in Ireland, so it's very easy for correlating it. But one of the things I do worry about is that if I have young cattle mandibles that are shattered, I may be missing them in my major method for establishing age for the cattle teeth in particular. To balance that out, I also have looked at the deciduous fourth premolar, which is erupting, coming into wear, and then falling out in the period prior to the emergence of the third molar. So it's a good way to get a peek at whether or not I'm missing a lot of younger individuals based on my major one. And the takeaway from this graph here is that you do not see many early wear DP4s, so that gives me some confidence that my aging method is not in an egregious way missing younger individuals. So the long and the short of that is that a lot of what I'm seeing is that cattle are being walked into Clonmacnoise in a way that is very familiar from other sorts of urban sites in Ireland. In some cases, that might be the stop. And certainly when I initially thought of this project many moons ago, I was thinking of that as, okay, the argument's done. And that was me falling into that deep split between rural and urban and kind of very simple relationships. And one of the wonderful things that's come up in the intervening years in Irish archaeology is something called a settlement cemetery, is one term for them. And you can see here, this is Nendrum in Northern Ireland, a very typical, prototypical really, setup for a monastery where you have ecclesiastical, obviously sacred work going on in the center, and then kind of concentric circles of other sorts of things going on. These are very clearly marked with ecclesiastical buildings. And the boom in excavation in Ireland has revealed a huge number of places that have lots of burial in them, other sorts of things which are the kinds of things you would see in a monastery. And there's lots of craft working, lots of settlement activity that is also what you would see in monasteries, but you're not seeing the obvious affiliation with the obvious marking of specific liturgical rituals, different kinds of buildings, that sort of stuff, which has led to a lot of questions. In my mind, I think these are an analogous phenomenon to what you're seeing with productive sites in Britain, where you're seeing the kinds of things that we associate with monasteries and with substantial monasteries suffused throughout the landscape at a whole bunch of different levels. And in support of that, and I won't go into this graph in any kind of detail, one of the other sets of places where you're starting to see this orientation on very old cattle, this emblem of a movement away from the full agricultural cycles of raising and consuming cattle to just getting a very selected set of cattle which have finished out their productive lives elsewhere. Interesting to me, these are by no means would I call these urban sites, but they are participating in this change. And for me, that's an interesting challenge into how do we think about these sorts of provisioning signatures as urban, as related to urban phenomena. And for me, this sinks the set of processes deeper. And this is a wonderful moment of entangling rural and urban places. With pigs, you see another very important set of activities that people have spent a lot of time thinking about in terms of urban settlements. Pigs are the second most common animal on on this site, which is a feature of urban sites in many locations in Ireland and elsewhere. Here is the full range of elements that I have, and you don't need to wrap your head around all of this. The two major points are, one, you do not see a huge difference between any of the phases. The range of parts that are here are not variable terribly across the different phases. And this was a hand-collected, largely unsieved assemblage. So some of the changes you do see, I think, probably are more attributable to changes in soil type and then collection strategies. The other point I would turn to is the prevalence of skulls outside of the first phase, where skulls do seem to be a bit rare. The other phases, you do seem to have a full cranial representation, which leads me to think about, and other parts of the skeletal part frequency lead me to think about whole animals being there, so that if they're not raised on the site, they are arriving as live animals there, or they are also raised on the site. One of the big distinctions between urban sites and rural sites in Ireland is in the age at death for pigs. And on a whole variety of different types of rural sites, you tend to see very concentrated ages of death in between that first and second year, which is not a surprising in terms of management of pigs, why you would be doing that. What's interesting is that gets diversified on urban sites. There's some variation in how it gets diversified, but it is diversified on those sites, which leads me to think that this is getting access to pigs, either because they are being raised on the site or otherwise managed in the neighborhood, so that they are more readily available than what is probably related to a seasonal slaughter pattern with this highly concentrated pattern you can see on Irish rural sites. Apparently, it is necessary if you're at this conference to talk about goats. And I will say the site that I'm working on now, the owner of the site, it's about an acre-sized island in Roscommon and Lough Key. In all his wisdom, the owner of the site has decided that it needs to house goats. And so we got to excavate with what my students lovingly called Siobhan here, who was a excavation partner with us all summer. And as in many places, the new graveyard assemblage does have a large number of goats, which by post-cranial elements, 10 or 15% of the goats, 10 or 15% of the caprines are goats, which is an enormously large percentage for anything other than one of these large urban centers in Ireland. Goats are often almost entirely absent elsewhere. So those are the three major things for those who are not working in following house too much. Three major points are: you've got the majority of cattle are, and I did mention they're female, killed at advanced age. You've got the dispersed kill pattern for pigs and the high prevalence of live goats on the site. Other end of this is manufacturing, and I'm very sorry Mark couldn't just answer my question about the balance between using cows for food and for other sorts of purposes. I have scratched my head over that endlessly, and it is difficult for me to get a good sense of it. Here are some very common criteria that people use. I will note that the age at death for both cats and dogs does not appear at Clonmacnoise in any of the phases. They are living to a ripe old age at this site in ways that they are often not on other sites. They are prevalent. Skeletal part frequencies and those sorts of things do match up. Not only do you have a high prevalence of goats, you have a particularly high prevalence of goat horns. Phase 1, there's 67% of the caprine cranial element, caprine horn cores, 74% in phase 2, and a little bit lower, 55% in phase 3. The last point I'll make, and the one that I have been most comfortable with in terms of looking at the development of manufacturing and trying to understand the role of craft production at this site, comes with red deer remains, which are not a huge percentage. They're a little over 1% in most of them, but I have found a very interesting break between postcranial and antler remains, where, as you see at the bottom rays, you have 3 rural sites which tend to have a fairly balanced cranial part versus antler versus cranial. And in these 2 middle places, 2 Irish urban settlements, you have virtually no postcranial remains. For the first 2 phases at Clonmacnoise, this would be from 7th century up through close to the year 1000, certainly through the well into the 10th century. You have what looks like a very rural pattern of deer part representation. They're getting access to deer bodies in ways that is unusual. And then in phase 3, where I'm seeing some other changes, you see that move into a range that is more typical. I'll go past this quickly. Usually, skeletal parts are present in terms of their food value. You see the red are the high, blue are the low ones. In the 3rd phase, one of the other things which has led me to think about manufacturing is one of the few smaller assemblages, these are pits that are probably manufacturing debris, are coming into an odd skeletal part representation, and you're seeing the distal foot elements, including the metapodia there, which it makes me wonder about that. One of my challenges in talking about Clonmacnoise and frankly in working in Ireland is it reminds me a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Descent into the Maelstrom. It is one of those places that you enter and all these sort of dramatic things are happening, but oftentimes people don't pop back out very much. And when they do, it's very hard to connect what they see with what's going on elsewhere. So what interests me, and I will go through this quickly because I can see that we're edging towards the end of time. My interest here is starting to, now that we have all these wonderful publications, to start to see how what I'm seeing at Clonmacnoise and in Ireland generally, how does that connect elsewhere? And I'll just take a couple of minutes to pull out a few ipswich from Ipswich that struck me as interesting. First of all, in terms of species prevalence, 2 things here. One, Ipswich is another place where cattle and pig are the dominant species, and as species that can be brought into urban centers and then managed within them. That's an interesting set of parallels. And the other thing which strikes me is the consistency over time here, which reminds me very much of Clonmacnoise. These are places that fell into a routine of sorts, and that routine endures for a long time. As with Clonmacnoise, you see a general tendency towards elderly cattle, but there's more variation here than I see. And you're seeing changes in the types of cattle that are arriving that I'm not seeing further out to the west in Ireland. The pig data is also more variable than I see at Clonmacnoise, but I also see some of the sort of dispersion that I associate with the kind of urban pig management that I believe what I'm seeing in Ireland. Finally, or not second to finally, pathologies are very rare at Clonmacnoise. These are not animals that are heavily devoted to traction and are being worked very hard in that way. And then finally, I think it's notable that the Ipswich deer, in this case, there's several kinds of deer, mimics very closely what I see with phase 3. So this is operating at a distance from the full body of a deer. Some general points just to offer up as I'm rounding out here. And it's very interesting how uncomfortable it is to move into another area and start to wrap my head around the ways of thinking in another area and then start to develop some connections. But I do think that there are some interesting general points of comparison. Both of these sites are in some ways established in the 7th century. Their establishment is certainly associated with burial in both cases, and maybe to a variable extent in terms of trading. Other religious activities at Clonmacnoise, which stand out, and the context for Ipswich with Rendlesham and Sutton Hoo is of course very different than what you see in Ireland, where you do not have anything like that sort of centralized state beginning to develop. It's a much more decentralized, dispersed sort of network. Both places expand around 700 with increased settlement density, intensification, a lot of the faunal features that I've mentioned before. One small thing, which I think is interesting, just getting back to this food versus manufacturing issue. After the Middle Saxon period at Ipswich, pits become the main source of zooarchaeological material. In the new graveyard assemblage, the final phase, phase 3, which dates to the 2nd millennium, so a little bit later than this, is also a case where pits become the major source. Ipswich paired doors through Viking period, through the Anglo-Saxon recovery, in a very consistent way. And so it is sort of as Ipswich is through much of its life. And that, to me, feels like a place that's very deeply rooted in its surroundings. Both of these sites decline after the respective Norman periods of these two areas. Clonmacnoise is a vital center for 500 years, and then for reasons that aren't totally clear, by the not too long after 1300, the settlement just disappears. And then finally, as I suggested with the ecclesiastical settlements, the settlement cemeteries, Pam has viewed Ipswich very much in the context and viewed urbanism in early medieval Britain in the context of productive places, which are sinking the trade and other sorts of movements of things around the landscape deeply into the landscape. They're not just in these small nodes. They are all over the place. I hope that gives you a sense of the kind of directions that I'm thinking. And let's go back to this to close out here. I hope that you can get some sense of where Ireland is beginning to emerge from the clouds here. And I think you're starting to see some interesting continuities across there. I will stop sharing there, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. And I absolutely love to see the comparison with Ipswich, because what I'm trying to play with now is Ipswich versus Antwerp, which is in some ways quite different, and then try to look at Rebay. And that's what I will be talking about in the SAA if I can get my act together. No, this was absolutely fabulous.
I thought your discussion of the similarities between Antwerp and Ipswich was very compelling, and that just is interesting at that in a very different setting further west. But that to me is fascinating, that these curiosities of the ways that animals move is consistent across these very different circumstances.
Sure, and I mean there are a couple of differences that make Antwerp look a little bit different. I think a little more embedded in the local landscape, which would have been much more forested. You know, that part of East Anglia was really, pretty treeless by the Middle Saxon period. Is that you do get about 10 of the pigs, which are slightly higher. You do get about 10% wild pig, which of course had been extirpated in Britain by the by Roman times, basically. And you also get an interesting sheep to goat ratio that looks a bit more like the Irish material than like Ipswich. You get about in the postcranial stuff about 1 goat to every 10 sheep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And which is, when I read the literature, something that I think is a good match. Goats will eat just about any, they're smart, but they'll also eat just about anything, including your house, if you let them. And so keeping the goat numbers down, but letting them lead the sheep, and some of the later medieval documents suggest that kind of a ratio. So it's, and you seem to have it throughout. You're getting more goat than we are, certainly at Ipswich. And certainly in East Anglia generally, not just the urban sites, but the rural stuff as well.
There are a couple of pigs which could possibly be, somewhere in the wild to feral range. In the Irish, there's a couple of very anomalous pigs that show up here and there, but it's a very, very small numbers. But I think that's fascinating. The consistency is fascinating because there are deep differences also. But so it feels to me like there are you have people across this vast region responding to similar sorts of things in the ways that make sense in the locales, I think.
Sure, and I think that's it, because looking at the new stuff from Rebay, one of the things you're seeing is, given its location, a lot more wild bird than anything I would be seeing at Ipswich as well. And I think, again, they are responding to the different circumstances. I have to ask you, because we've got about 10 more minutes, and this has been something, have you talked to Ruth Carden about the big dogs?
I have not.
Okay, you absolutely must, because this is something that the only good thing I will say about X that used to be Twitter is that several of us who do early medieval faunal collections, particularly the urban stuff, were on there. And she had this huge picture of this huge dog mandible, and she said this was from one of the excavations within Viking Dublin. And then a couple of us chimed in and said, we have some big dogs from Eastern England, some of them from York, some of them, in my case, coming particularly out of West Stowe. Mine aren't quite as big as yours, but they're good, big junkyard dogs, German Shepherd sized things. And she had this mandible that was literally the size of her hand. So, and she was trying to put together a Viking dog project, which is not just the Viking towns, but also contemporary material from all over the medieval world. So shoot her an email and said that Pam Crabtree came, you must come talk about the dogs.
Thank you. I will absolutely. Yeah. So it's an assembly I did during the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, and it's sort of sitting there. I haven't had a chance. I think hopefully it's this is Con Manning's excavation of Clonmacnoise I said they will be moving to publication in the next year or two. So this is perfect timing, because I've got to go back to the basic report and tidy that sort of stuff up.
No,
thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff. And, ultimately we'd like to, the idea, if we can raise the money, and she's done a little bit of fundraising, is not only do the conventional archaeozoology, but do some of the isotopic work and some of the ADNA work, and see, just the issue of, you've got one hell of a big dog. What's it eating? What is it eating, first of all? And then where is it getting it? How mobile is it, in terms of things like strontium? So let me just see if we got anything in the chat. Hold on really quickly. Okay, we do. This is excellent. Okay, this is from Mark, and he said, excellent stuff, John. Any variations in the fish and or birds?
Right. Yeah. There are very few fish remains. I said it was a hand collected site, so in some ways not surprising. I did do just as I could one season there, kind of just did small bit of wet screening just to see if I could come up with anything. And I didn't. There were spotty fish. And Sheila Hamilton Dyer did the fish and the bird report. And I'd be happy to send it to you. I'm not remembering gigantic conclusions out of the fish. They're fairly small numbers. I have a cormorant out of another assemblage, which was not surprising in that location. Not a surprising dominance of domestic fowl in that case. Not some of the interesting changes you're seeing at Ipswich, but sort of kind of an ephemeral presence here and there.
Excellent. Okay, no, this is absolutely perfect. Let me just make sure I haven't missed anything in the chat here. Okay, I am absolutely delighted to introduce Lluís Lloveras from Barcelona. He recently hosted an absolutely fabulous conference on medieval monasticism that I was privileged to attend, and we are absolutely delighted to have him here. And the title of his presentation is Meat and Fish Consumption in Medieval and Post-Medieval Monasteries in Barcelona, Spain, according to Zooarchaeological and documentary evidence. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. I'm very grateful for inviting me to participate in this conference. I am going to talk about meat and fish consumption in medieval and post-medieval monasteries in Barcelona, in Spain. This is a research that is part of a research project called Montbons, which main aim is to generate new knowledge about lifeways in past Barcelona convents and monastery. The study of the diet is an essential component of the reconstruction of past populations, and this is a topic of particular interest in monastic establishments, given that in this context, diet is very restricted by the rules established by the different religious orders. In general, food supply was organized according to the dietary rules that restricted or banned the consumption of meat. Here I am going to talk about the importance of both meat and fish in the diet of the friars and nuns, using the results obtained in the Zooarchaeological analysis, but I will also contrast our results with the documentary data available. Well, the sites under study are three: one monastery and two friaries. In this ancient plan from Barcelona region, you can see the location of all sites. The monastery of Santa Maria de Pedralbes is located on the northwest edge of the city of Barcelona, below the Collserola Hills. This monastery is nowadays integrated in the city. However, when it was constructed in the Middle Ages, it was not far from the town and from the court of Barcelona, but at the same time, it was an isolated and quiet place. The friaries of Santa Caterina and San Agustí are both located in the center of the city. In medieval times, this was still a marginal area that started to be built up just in the 13th century when the monasteries or the friaries were founded. Pedralbes was founded by Queen Elisenda de Montcada, the fourth wife of the King James II, in 1327. And it hosted a poor clerks community that resided in the monastery from its origin to present day. Santa Caterina was founded in 1243 by the Bishop of Barcelona, and it hosted a Dominicans community that resided in the monastery until the 19th century, when it was demolished and replaced by a market. And San Agustí was founded in 1309. It was occupied by the Augustinians community until the beginning of the 18th century, when, as a result of the siege of Barcelona during the War of the Spanish Succession, the monastery suffered extensive damage and the religious community moved to another area. All of them are mendicant orders. That means that they depended for their survival on the goodwill of the people to whom they preach. However, in the case of Pedralbes, the monastery also had lands and properties that provided them with important incomes and tithes. Since 1999, several archaeological excavations were conducted in different areas of all monasteries. And during the field works, human remains, animal bones, and many other archaeological remains were recovered. In the case of Pedralbes, the archaeological deposits were wet sieved through a 1 millimeter mesh. However, the other samples consisted only of hand-collected fauna remains. This is important to be taken into consideration because this fact introduces a size bias favoring larger species and larger anatomical parts. The materials used in the analysis consisted in all fauna remains recovered in the three monasteries. Mammals, birds, fish, shells, and reptiles have been all analyzed. We use classical zooarchaeological and taphonomic methods of a study. On the whole, almost 14,000 remains from Pedralbes, 1,369 from Santa Caterina, and 2,304 from San Agustí were analyzed. In Santa Caterina, medieval and post-medieval samples were studied separately. However, in the other cases, all fauna remains were analyzed as a unique assemblage. As you can see in the graph, the different taxonomic groups were very similarly represented. In all the cases, mammals stand out, represented by almost 90% of remains. They are followed by birds and fish. Malacological remains and some other taxa were present, but of minor importance in all the cases. The most important differences that we can see in this graph is the major representation of birds in Santa Caterina, especially compared to San Agustí, and also the larger number of fish remains in Pedralbes. Later, we will discuss the reasons of these differences. In all cases, mammals are represented by the main domestic livestock, and very little taxonomic diversity is observed. Caprines always dominate with more than 80% of remains. They are mostly sheep. In fact, goat remains were only identified in San Agustí and in very few numbers. Sheep are followed by pigs and cattle, which were similarly represented, except in Pedralbes, where cattle bones are scarcer. Other taxa, such as rabbits and cats, were also identified in all the assemblages, but in few numbers. The analysis of the anatomical representation shows that in sheep and pigs, almost all skeletal elements are present, but they are differently represented. The most abundant bones are those associated to meaty parts, such as the shoulder and leg. Ribs and vertebrae are also well represented, and the worst represented are normally bones from crania and autopodium. The only exception to this is observed in San Agustí, where sheep portions of lower mid-fluids, such as crania and metapodials, are also well represented. And as you can see in this graph, where relative abundance from San Agustí and Pedralbes are compared. Differences are also observed with cattle, but in this case, between Pedralbes and Santa Caterina. The latter is the monastic house with the greatest numbers of cattle remains. The anatomical patterns are also very different. Beef meat was clearly consumed in Santa Caterina, but not in Pedralbes, where only metapodial bones were recovered, and they were probably used to obtain other resources. We believe that probably to prepare jelly. Regarding the age at death data, for all taxa, results indicate a kill-off pattern strongly focused on animals culled at the optimal point in carcasses growth rate for meat production. Sheep were normally culled late in their first year and into the second and the beginning of the third years. And cattle and pigs, according to the epiphyseal fusion stages, also indicate the dominance of immature individuals, normally less than 1.5 years. In all cases, the degree of fragmentation of bone remains is high, with more than 90% of fragmented remains normally presenting fresh fracture patterns. Batchery traces related to different batchery activities, such as disarticulation, defleshing, and fragmentation, were recorded in high number of remains. Both cuts and chop marks were recognized, but chops were clearly more abundant. In the case of Santa Caterina, for instance, 30% of remains displayed chop marks. The fragments are fairly uniform in size. For instance, ribs are normally about 5 centimeters length. Limb bones normally are divided in 2 or 3 pieces. Vertebrae are also almost always chopped. The fragments suggest a first division of the entire animal carcasses into 2 halves along the sagittal plane to be later fragmented in smaller pieces. Here you can see some examples of the cuts and chops registered in different types of bones. Well, as occurred with mammals, birds also show little taxonomical diversity. All samples are clearly dominated by the domestic fowl, which represents around 80% of identifier remains in all the samples. It is followed by far by other galliforms, such as the pheasant in Santa Catarina or the turkey and red-legged partridge in Pedralbes, and we also identified some remains of pigeons, geese, and ducks. Results show that bones related to the leg, wing, and breast are more abundant. When the body parts represented in the sample are classified according to the amount of meat provided, it is clear that bones associated to meaty parts are best represented, reaching, in the case of Pedralbes, for instance, more than 60%. Wing and leg extremities, axial and cranial bones are clearly less represented. Cuts and chop marks related to the dividing of animal carcasses into portions were also found in all samples. They are less abundant than in mammals. Mostly are located on the proximal or distal parts of the humerus, radius, femur, and tibial probably as a result of the removal of the wing and the leg. A significant percentage of bone presenting tooth marks has also been registered. Normally they are a very thin tooth marks that has been identified as produced by cats. Between 5 and 50% of remains, depending on the assemblages, belong to immature individuals. And regarding sex estimation, the presence of medullary bone in broken shaft of different long bones account for the existence of hens inlaid in all the samples. This presence of young individuals and laying hens suggests the existence of a chicken coop in the same monasteries, with part of the chickens being bred for meat and also part used when adults for egg production. Fish remains samples are small, particularly those of Santa Catarina and San Agustí. This is clearly related with the recovery methods used, as I have mentioned at the beginning. Sediments were not sieved, but despite this scarcity, results are interesting because show important differences between monasteries. Curiously, Pedralbes, which has the greatest number of remains, is the one with the least taxonomic diversity. The sample is dominated by 2 large species, hake and cod, followed by smaller fish such as pandora and sardines. Santa Catarina shows the larger taxonomical diversity with a sample characterized by the presence of large and expensive species such as different species of tuna, meagre, and common dentex. And in San Agustí, the sample is dominated by the school shark, cod, tuna, and pandora. Most of the species indicate the consumption of local fish that would have easily been caught near the city shores. However, some species such as cod and probably part of the hake arrived salted from the Atlantic. The majority of remains are vertebrae, but bones from crania and shoulder girdle are also represented. The reasons for the abundance of vertebrae are several. This is a bone that is more abundant in the skeleton than others. Also, the robustness of vertebrae, and also because when fish were purchased, dried or sliced, part of the fish bones were not present. In all samples, a clear bias against the presence of a small fish species is observed. In summary, zooarchaeological data indicate that mammals, birds, and fish were all imported in the diet of Barcelona monastery houses. Other taxonomic groups, such as mollusks or reptiles, were only consumed very occasionally. According to our results, meat was more important than fish, but this is a point that needs to be discussed. Among meats, mammals and particularly lamb stands out. It is clear that it is the most consumed type of meat in all monasteries. Pork is also important, but much less than lamb. In all cases, I studied pork is represented in similar proportions. Beef was important in Santa Catarina, also consumed in San Agustin, but it was not consumed in Pedralbes. Rabbit was present in the diet of all monasteries, but also consumed very occasionally. And cats were present, but not related to consumption. The age at death and the parts consumed indicate that best quality meat was selected in most cases. The occurrence of cats is also interesting because they are registered in all the samples. Their presence is confirmed by different records because we have identified cat remains in all samples. Also, the cat footprints are present in the floor tiles in all the monasteries, and also we have registered signs of carnivore meowing that has been identified as produced by cats. Besides, in the case of Pedralbes, there is also an area that is called the cloister of the cats, which attests the presence of these animals in the monastic house and denotes the coexistence of nuns with these animals. All suggest that cats were animals kept in the monasteries premises, probably to control pests, and that they had access to animal remains discarded by the nuns and friars after their meals. And this is important to take into account because it is probably that this commensal species was responsible for part of the destruction of the smallest elements, less abundance in all the samples. Well, what say documentary data about mammals? On the whole, documents are consistent with the importance of lamb, which it is clearly the most purchased type of meat in all the cases. The accounting books also indicate that pork was probably more important in the diet of nuns and friars than what the zooarchaeological data indicate. And the reason is that often the pork meat purchased was dried meat with no bones, such as bacon. And this seems to be part of many dishes, but left not physical evidences. There is little information about the acquisition of beef, but probably in Santa Catarina it was consumed more commonly than what the documents says. Documents also are consistent with our results with rabbit, indicating that it was consumed in very particular days, normally once or 2 times a year. Our results indicate that bears were also important, but much less common than mammals, particularly the domestic fowl. Hens, capons, chicken, and also eggs must have played an important role in the diet of the monastic houses. Documents are also consistent with their results. It is indicated that birds were acquired to be eaten in special festivities or also when important guests came to the monastery. For instance, in Pedralbes, in one of the counting books, it is notated that it is indicated that for the Boxing Day meal, 28 parts of hens were acquired. Species such as turkey, partridge, or pheasant were probably consumed on very special occasions. Regarding fish, we have identified a significant number of species. However, the number of fish remains is very scarce compared to mammals. Our results also show differences in the species consumed in the different monastic houses. And when we take into account the textual data, it seems that in this case, our results and textual information do not match. It is clear that all monastic establishments follow the order rules, and that according to these rules, fasting and abstinence are mandatory. And the main food should be of plant origin with contributions of fish and meat in exceptional days. It seems clear that meat was more important than what rules indicate. However, it seems also clear that during fasting periods, fish was the staple food. And for the reasons should be more important than what zooarchaeological data indicate. In fact, account books show that fish were regularly bought along the year. Fresh fish was purchased in the fisheries, but also they had special agreements with fishermen. In the case of Pedralbes, it is also notated that a large number of salted sardines were acquired. For the reason, our results from the zooarchaeological analysis do not match with this importance of fish in the diet. The reason is the existence of a bias, which it's partly consequence of a recovery problem. It is clear because when sediments are not safe, the loss of small elements implies that smaller species of fish are practically not represented. However, in the case of Pedralbes, where sediments were seized, the sample is larger, but still do not match with what documents indicates. The sample is still low when compared to other taxonomic groups and and considering what document says. The reasons could be several. One could be the purchase of large quantities of salted large species that arrive with no bones. And also, in the case of a small species such as sardines, the activity of carnivores, as we have seen in the case of the cats, may have disadvantaged the preservation of these elements. In conclusion, we can say that meat and fish were both important in the diet of nuns and friars from Barcelona. according to our results, meat was probably more important than what the order rules indicate, and fish was more important than what zooarchaeological data shows. We have also verified that in general, quality meat and fish was consumed, and that meat was normally cooked in stews and soups. The diet follow a fairly monotonous rhythm in terms of the species consumed and the way of preparing them. It seems also clear that the quality of meat and fish varied according to the privilege enjoyed by the monastery. Santa Caterina was one of the most important friaries in Barcelona. The seemingly rich diet appears far from the conception of monastic diets as austere and restrictive, and this could be linked to Santa Caterina high status and its links to the socio-political elites of Barcelona. In the case of Pedralbes, the monastery was a wealthy institution and many of the nuns were aristocrats. It seems clear that the nuns consume quality meat and fish. However, they were more austere than the friars from Santa Caterina. And finally, San Agustí seems to behave more like a mendicant friary in relation to the food consumed, with access to different quality animal resources. We have shown the presence of some unappreciated mammal portions and lower portion of birds in the assemblage. And that's all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fabulous. And I want to start out with a question for you, because I have been working on some early modern material from New York City, and we also have lots of cats, and we're seeing, including both, none of them which have been processed in any way, no evidence of cut marks, anything like that, but lots of bits and pieces of cat that got mixed in with the domestic trash. And we're also seeing some of the things that you were seeing, particularly the tooth marks on some of the bird material as well. So I think, your point about the role of cats in urban assemblages is very well taken. And it's something that we had seen to a bit of a lesser degree when we looked at some of the material, the early modern material from Manhattan, but we're now looking at a site in Brooklyn that, and so I think, there may be some big commonalities in the nature of early modern urban assemblages that probably transcend both sides of the Atlantic.
Yes, sure. I think that it's particularly interesting because it seems that there are always cats in monasteries, and because we have checked that all bones, mammal bones, but especially bird bones, are affected by the cats, and it is clear that small bones disappear when the cat had access to these materials, and particularly with small fish bones. I am sure that they disappear. For the reason it is very interesting to take into account that the presence of this animal in these establishments, because they can alter the results of the zooarchaeological analysis conducted, creating a bias in this.
Yeah, and it really raised some questions for me that I'm doing the bird and mammal material, but a colleague of mine is working on the fish, and we sieve, so we have quite a lot of fish, but I'll be really interested to see the balance between the larger fish and the smaller fish, and to what extent the cats could have affected the preservation of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe that cats affected particularly the preservation of small fish. And in the case of our studies, it is particularly relevant in Pedralbes, because in Pedralbes, because the sediments were sieved, we recovered very, very tiny bones. So, and we have identified a significant amount of sardine bones. But when we look at documents, it is clear that sardines were consumed more often than the numbers we have in the zooarchaeological analysis. And I think that the best explanation is that, that cats probably affected, maybe also humans, because when we eat sardines, maybe part of the bones are also ingested, but mostly carnivores like cats. In the case of the other samples, small fish like sardines were not recovered because the recovery methods were not adequate. These were not affected by cats, but also some of the bones in the case of Santa Catarina, for instance, we have checked that they consume large species of fish, and normally this large of fishes, this large species should have to be bought in slices. It is not possible to buy the whole fish, and when you buy slices, of course, normally the cranial bones are not present, and this also implies that not all the bones of the fish are present in the sample. There are different questions that contribute to create this type of assemblages where not all bones are recovered.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because we got a grant a number of years ago to build up our comparative collection on the fish side. And one of the things you had to do if you went to the market, of course, they wanted to immediately take the heads off and things like that. And then there were some big things that you just couldn't get a whole fish on, or not on the grant money that we got. So just the question of portioning, I think it is really, particularly if we're dealing with things that would have been purchased through markets in late medieval, early modern times.
What seems clear is that the fish was in fact important in the diet of our communities, and it's also clear that was more important that our zooarchaeological data indicate. And this is also confirmed by the isotope analysis. We have also conducted isotope analysis, carbon and hydrogen with human remains, and in all the monasteries indicate an important consumption of fish. So it's not only documents, also isotopes all indicates the importance of fish that is not found in the zooarchaeological record.
Yeah, that's one of the things that sadly we're missing in the work that we're doing right now, is its entire, we have trash, but we don't have any human materials. And I have another question, and I should have written it down, and let me think for a minute, and let me just check the chat. Yes, in the Pedrobles material, clearly from the documentary sources, these were wealthy women and it was a wealthy monastery. But the difference between, for example, the cattle showing up in the male monasteries and not in the nunneries I guess, how does that point to differences, gender differences between the monasteries and the nunneries? And is this something that is unique to Barcelona, or has it been seen elsewhere?
I think that there is a gender question here that we have to deep on this point yet. And it is clear that differences related to gender has been detected in different places. Not only with food, but also with buildings, with the spaces, with different questions. And it seems clear that being aristocrats and wealthy people are more austere than friars, and I think that the reason is probably related to a gender question, but we have to deep in this because it's always difficult not to deal with this type of things, but probably is.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm going to take a point of privilege here because I have some news that I am happy to announce, which is, as some of you may know, I worked on the St. Albans Abbey fauna back in the 1980s when I was just starting out. And it has been a long, slow process to get the final publication coming, but I'm happy to announce that it has gone to the publisher, all 800 pages of it, and it will be available on June 12th, which I'm absolutely delighted to see. It is the most, I helped with the proofreading, and the Zooarch is a teeny piece of this, but a real comprehensive study of the historical record, the people who are buried, the architecture, the art, and it's been longer in the making in part because one of the original excavators, Beata Colby Biddle, passed on a number of years ago, but this was work done by her and by Martin Biddle, and it will be out, and it makes me terrifically happy to say that, and I believe there's going to be a big ceremony. So that's really a good lead into what I want to say to everybody. First of all, this was 6 great papers, and I am delighted to have had you all here and profoundly grateful for this. I know that if people are willing, Dean Santarocco would like to turn this into a volume, and I would certainly love to be part of that if you're willing. And I will send you, he is out of town. He wears about 15 hats in the university. At one point he was dean of the college, and now he's head of NYU's substation in Washington, DC. You know, we have a global campus that also includes DC and Tulsa, and he's not here, but I will chat with him when he gets back. He has been a terrific supporter of archaeology, even though he himself is a classicist and focuses on texts. And I really, you know, to conclude, I want to say how much I appreciate everything he's done for the archaeology program. And he's worked really, you know, just to bring us an undergraduate archaeology minor, which I think was sorely needed, because one of the issues that we face in ancient studies is we sit in a dozen different departments across not just arts and sciences, where I live and where Dean Santarocco lives, but the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, for example, and the Tisch School, actually, which is our performing arts undergraduate and graduate programs, actually has some classicists and archaeologists as well. So I want to really thank everyone. When I talk to Professor Santarocco, I will get back to you about issues of publication. I want to thank, this is a sponsored seminar, and I absolutely want to thank the sponsors. And I also want to thank Anna, who is basically Dean Santarocco's right-hand woman, who has been just a fabulous contributor to this. And again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for doing this. And thank you to the audience as well. So with that, if there is nothing else in the chat, I will thank everyone and we will say goodbye.